Hi everyone, this is the recorded version of the grass workshop that we held along with Lindsay Gonzalez. She is the small acreage coordinator for Boulder County, and myself, Carla Melgar. I am the small acreage management regional specialist for the Front Range. And this workshop was brought to you thanks to Small Acreage Management, Boulder County Extension, and USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service. So, on this part of the workshop, I'm going to be talking about pasture revegetation and some of the steps and tips that you can take to make sure that you have a successful revegetation plan. So, let's get started. One of the first ideas that most people have in mind for revegetating a field whenever they come to me and ask questions about what's the best way to grow some grass back in their fields is they usually want to reseed everything, and hopefully in a year or two they will have enough vegetation so that they can get back either to grazing or just have a nice landscape in their land. Um, the truth is sometimes that's not the best place to start. I think one of the best things that you can do if you are in that process is to start asking yourself, why do you need to reseed? And that will help you guide you through actually deciding whether or not you need to reseed or if you need to make a change of management. So, a few of those questions that you should be asking yourself before starting on a project of revegetation is start thinking, why are you so unhappy with the pastures? Are your pastures too weedy, but there's still a little bit of desirable grasses in there? Are your grasses too thin? Are they not performing to the point where you would like it to, especially if you are grazing animals? Are you being able to provide them with enough forage? And then other questions would be, why is the ground bare in the case that you don't have that much vegetation at all? Um, there might be an issue with a long overgrazing history or the effects of drought years, because the thing with those two um, events is that you're not going to start seeing the effects as it happens. Drought is going to start deteriorating your grasses as the years pass or as the seasons pass, and then your grasses will definitely be weaker after a drought process. And the same thing happens with overgrazing. You might still have enough grass for your animals for a couple of years, but eventually you will get to the point where your grass stands are too weak to support their production cycle. And another thing is, do you have poor soils? Are you removing most of the nutrients and not adding any nutrients back into the soil? That could also be an issue that you might need to manage. So, after you've thought a little bit about those questions, what options do you have for revegetating your pasture? And a couple ways of looking at it is, if you can't change why the soil is bare, then probably changing that management should be the first step. So all of those things related to drought and overgrazing, that's going to require you to do a little bit of change in terms of the management that you give to your land, and that might help reduce the need for a reseeding project as opposed to stuff that you can't change from your land. So um, consider those things that might not be helping your grasses grow. So maybe there's a lot of compaction, maybe there's a lot of climatic issues, maybe you're not getting as much rain as you used to 10 years ago because things are changing. So consider, if that's the case, consider other plants that are better suited for that type of issues, usually the environmental issues that you can't fix or you can't manage. Then maybe you're going to have to start thinking about grass species that are better adapted for those situations. So, if you already decided that you do need to reseed or at least overseed part of your field, how do you choose the best grass species is going to depend a lot on some of those factors that you can't control. So, your soil type is going to be one thing that you want to try get to know a little bit better so that you can choose species that work well in those soil types. Soil nutrients And when I talk about soil nutrients, I'm talking about some of the nutrients or some of the chemical properties of your soils that are a little bit harder to manage. So initially, you want to take a soil test and make sure that you have enough nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and all of those nutrients that your plants need to start growing. But there's going to be other stuff that you're not going to be able to change so much. So that's going to be your soil pH or your soil salinity or acidity. Those are things that you can add maybe some amendments to try and fix them and bring them down to a level where your grasses can be more productive. But chances are you're going to need to choose something that's better adapted for that. Changing the salts on the soil, it's going to take a lot of inputs, it's going to take a lot of work. Same thing happens with pH, which in the Front Range is usually pretty high, and lowering the pH of an area is going to take a few years, and it might not even happen, or it might actually start bringing out some other issues with nutrient balances and stuff. So you are probably better off choosing a grass species that's better suited for your soil pH and your soil salts and things like that. So definitely take a soil test and make sure that you get to know your soils and try to add the stuff that you need, or try to lower down some of those nutrients, try to do some management of those nutrients in the soil. Then there's going to be other stuff like elevation, slope, rocks, moisture, and precipitation that are also going to make a big impact in terms of what grass species you are able to choose. So, a few of the tools that I like to use. The first thing is the Colorado Forage Guide. You might already be familiar with it. If not, make sure to check it out because it's going to give you a lot of options in terms of grasses that you can choose for an area, especially for forage production, or if you're grazing animals. That's going to be a great resourceful tool for you to look up what grass species can provide enough forage for the animals that you're trying to graze. But one thing that I really like about the forage guide is the Appendix A that you can see here on the screen. The Appendix A has some species suggestions for different sites, depending on your soil type. So you're going to have a few options for grasses that are better adapted for clay and loam soils, those heavier soils, and going to tell you a little bit whether or not they are native or introduced. You can find options for sandy soils and stuff like that. So this would be a great place to start once you know what type of soil you have, and if you want to go for something introduced or something native or the combination of both. And then you can also find in the Appendix B of the Colorado Forest Guide, here's more examples of different plant species that you can use in different soil types with different moisture conditions. So you're going to have some that will definitely need to be irrigated, and then you're going to have some that are better suited for some of those drier areas of the state. So again, this is a great place to start looking for some options of grasses once you know kind of what you want and the soil type that you have. And another great tool that I like to use a lot to help me with just figuring out what soil type I have is the Soil Web Survey. So this is a tool from the NRCS, and you can look it up. It's just look up Soil Web Survey, and it allows you to type in your address or the address of the property that you are working with, and you can draw a polygon as you can see in the image, and it will give you a list of the soil types that you have based on their images that they have for that area. And if you start digging a little bit deeper into this tool, you can probably find the ecological region for your area. And what that ecological region tells you is it gives you general look into what is the ecological composition of the areas that are similar to yours. So what's the vegetation composition, for example? what is the natural composition of grasses versus forbs versus trees in that area, for example. And it will also tell you or give you a little bit of an idea of what native grass species grow in that ecological region or in similar ecological regions. So you definitely don't have to start digging that deep, but if you can get your soil type from here, it's a great help, at least initially, to start sorting out some of those grass species that are better adapted to your area. And so, getting back to the keys to successful planting, I'm going to be talking about some of the other things that you can do to make sure that your revegetation process is successful. So, usually, the place where I tell people to start is by making a plan for weed management. This is a great place to start because sometimes if you can get rid of that weed pressure over your new grass ceilings, that's going to take you a long ways, or even just taking care of the weeds and letting the grasses do their own work. And it, of course, sounds easier said than done, but if you can identify some of the weeds or most of the weeds, ideally, from your land, and you can identify their life cycle and what's the best time to start controlling them and the best way to do that, then you're going to start seeing a lot of changes and a lot of progress. And hopefully, in the future, you're not going to have that big of an issue with not having enough forage because your weeds are taking over. So, the reason why starting with weed management is so important, it's also because in the process of grasses or grass ceilings getting established, there's going to be a lot less options for what methods you can use to control weeds. And the weeds are going to start germinating before the grasses. A lot of them will. And a lot of them will be a lot of competition for your little grass seedlings. So if you want to set them up for success, make sure that they don't have as much pressure from other things trying to take the moisture and the nutrients that they need and that access to the sun and water and all that. Um, if your way of managing weeds is going to be through herbicide applications, then you definitely want to start doing that at least 1 or 2 seasons before you go in and seed your grasses, because you're going to have some herbicide restrictions. And if you read a label, especially for broadleaf plants, you're going to see that it's technically not supposed to harm grass type plants, but there's going to be a little bit of a restriction between when you can spray those herbicides and when you can start planting your grass seedlings. It might not kill grasses, but it might injure them in some way. So you definitely want to be cautious and follow those rest periods after you apply the herbicide and make sure that you got enough of that seed bank exhausted. If you're relying on grazing for controlling weeds, then that's another issue that you're going to have, because if you have enough weeds growing at the same time as your grass seedlings, then your animals that are grazing for weed management are probably just going to eat everything. So definitely not the best way to go. And weedy grasses will be harder to control down the line, so definitely make sure to exhaust that weedy grass seed banks. So stuff like cheatgrass, crabgrass, they're going to represent a big challenge to manage in the future if you don't exhaust that seed bank before you go in and try to establish other grasses. And so going back to that part where I was talking about, making sure that you ID some of the weeds and some of their life cycle is going to be very important if you want to get a hold of like a good plan to manage those weeds. You want to identify what are your annual plants, your annual weeds, and your biennials and your perennials, because they're going to have different management times, different periods during the year where it's better to target some of the weeds rather than the others. And so um, annual weeds are obviously plants that only live for a year or one season. um, and they only reproduce from seeds. So definitely making sure that you can control them or you can kill them before seed production is going to go a long ways in terms of exhausting that seed bank. And you're going to have two types of annual weeds. So you can have winter annuals that must be controlled before they set seeds in early summer. So anytime before that in the spring would be a good time to start doing all of those management techniques for those winter annuals. And then you're going to have your summer annuals that must be controlled before they set seed in the middle to late summer or fall. So again, doing some weed management during the spring and the summer is going to control some of those weeds before they're able to produce the seeds. And one very important thing about annual weeds is spraying after seed production is pointless. The weeds have already pretty much completed their whole life cycle. After they produce seeds, they're on their way of dying. So spraying them is just not worth it. They're already done the harm that they were going to do. So the best way to do if you have annual weeds that have already produced seeds is to pick them up, remove them from the field, put them on a plastic bag away, and make sure that you can collect as much of the seeds as possible so that they don't keep adding to I'm sorry, to that seed bank. And then encouraging desirable plant competition. It's a great way of preventing out of control invasion of annual weeds. So if you already have some grasses growing, um, try to reduce a little bit of that mowing, and hopefully that will outcompete some of those annual weeds. Then you're going to have your biennial weeds, which also reproduce only from seeds, but they can grow back from cut vegetative tissue. So if your plan of controlling a biennial weed is just to cut it down, there's a good chance that it will just grow back from where it was cut, or it might grow from a different area, but they do have that capacity of growing back after they've been cut. So when you are trying to control biennial weeds, remove as much of the plant and the root as you can. But going back to their whole life cycle, biennial plants require 2 years to complete their growth cycle. So usually the seeds start germinating in the spring, and then the following year or the following season, they will start growing some of the flowers and some of the seeds. So if you see stuff like a mullein during the first year is going to remain little, it's only going to have leaves, but then the following year is going to start growing that stalk with the flowers, and that's a point where you are probably better off just trying to cut off that piece of the plant that has the seeds and get rid of it, because that plant is pretty much done with their life cycle. They have already produced seeds. So again, spraying the plants once they're in that second year of their life cycle might not be worth it. So again, the key to control is to prevent seed formation and seed establishment. And another key to controlling biennial weeds is to start controlling them during the fall, because the fall is a time when these plants start bringing in some of that energy to store in the root system so that they can grow back in the spring after they break dormancy. So if you're spraying, for example, a biennial weed, the fall would be a great time, because then they will move all of that herbicide into the root system and it will eventually kill the plant before it's able to produce the seeds. And now perennial weeds are going to be plants that live for many years, and you can have simple perennials that reproduce only from seeds, but similar to the biennial weeds, if you cut them, they might have that ability to grow again from that part that was left in the field. But you can also have your creeping perennials that can reproduce from seeds or below ground stems or creeping root systems. So these are a little bit harder to control, because you're gonna have to attack and kill the whole plant so that they cannot produce any more plants in the process of their life. So herbicide application similar to a biennial weed. will be more effective if you do it in the fall. That's again that time when the plants are moving that energy from their leaves down to their root system so that they can grow back and break dormancy the next season. Mechanical control can be effective during certain periods of the year so that you can prevent the plants from producing that energy that they will later translocate to the root system. So in the spring and in the summer, you can cut those plants frequently, you can mow them frequently, and hopefully that way you can reduce the plant's ability to produce energy to survive. It might be effective if you do it with enough frequency that they can't produce any energy at all, but there's a good chance that it might not work. Usually, for perennial plants, it's very important to use a combination. Sorry. So again, for this type of weeds, you're gonna want to take multiple approaches to controlling them. Do not rely only on one method. Don't rely only on cutting or mowing. You're probably gonna need a combination of things so that you can work with them or try to control them in the best time in the best way possible. So another thing about weed management, like I just said before, integrated weed management is going to be the best way to go, especially because you're most likely going to have more than one different type of weed in terms of life cycle. So choosing different methods will give you a better chance of controlling different weeds and different weed types. So a few things to consider when choosing a method or different methods for controlling is to consider whether those methods are good, if they're affordable, are they cheap, do they act fast enough so that you can prevent some of that seed production. So I just wanted to put this chart in the video to help you kind of analyze some of those control methods for weeds. So for example, you're going to have your grazing management that can sometimes go a long ways in terms of controlling weeds. So grazing management can prevent some of the weeds from overpopulating a space by only grazing enough of the grasses so that your animals have food, but also so that they can keep some of that leaf to produce their own food, and that will help them be more competitive against the weeds and avoid some of those bare spots of soil where weeds can grow. So grazing management can be a very good strategy. It can be very cheap because you're not having to bring anything else outside of your field, but it's not going to be something that's going to happen overnight. Getting a hold of a good grazing management, it might take you a few seasons, it might take you a couple years until you finally figure out the best way of managing grazing so that you can favor from animals grazing in terms of controlling weeds. Another good and cheap method of weed control is going to be pulling weeds. It definitely is cheap, it definitely does the work, but if you have large infestations, that's just not feasible. It's just not uh, the most efficient method once when you have a few acres of just weeds, unless you have a big crew of people that are willing to help you. Biocontrols can also be very good and can be cheap, but they're not gonna destroy completely field, especially a big field that's overpopulated with weeds. So other strategies can be mowing or flaming or tilling. That can be done very quickly. All it takes is for you to do it once, and it's gonna be relatively cheap if you already have the equipment in hand. But there's a good chance that those weeds will grow back, especially those biennials or perennial weeds. If you are relying only on these methods, it's not going to be 100% the way to go. You can also hire a person to do the maintenance in your property and do all of those things at the same time. It's going to be fast, it's going to be good, but it's not going to be the cheapest method. And another method of weed suppression could be cover crops. Cover crops are very good at suppressing weeds because they cover the soil and they take advantage of some of the moisture and some of the poor soil conditions that you may have, and it can bring a lot of different benefits to your land. They can break down the soil and do a little bit of reducing compaction and things like that, but it's not going to be something that happens very fast. It's going to take you at least one season to grow those cover crops, and it's going to take a long time before that for you to figure out the seeds and figure out the type of work that your soil needs to be most adequate for those cover crops. But it definitely can provide some of that weed suppression and some of that moisture retention that comes with cover crops. So one last thing about weed management, and then we can move on for the rest of the topics of this webinar. Patience is key. Weed management is not going to happen probably in one season. You're going to need a couple of seasons to see some of the weeds and make sure that you at least have knowledge of what is growing in your field. And that might not happen only in the summer. You're going to need to wait until the fall to see what other weeds come out and how much of a seed bank you have, and then you're going to have to wait for the right moment to attack those weeds. So it's definitely not going to happen overnight or over one season. It might take a couple years. So patience is key, and making sure that you take as long as needed for weed management is going to ensure that you have a better chance of succeeding with grass planting because of the reasons I said before. You're going to have more restrictions for managing weeds once you have your grass seeds in place. And something that you shouldn't forget, it's also there will always be some kind of weed. You're not going to have a pristine field with absolutely no weed, but you have to bring it to a point where it's manageable, where it's not representing that much of a pressure for your grass seedlings. So, another important aspect of a revegetation process is to pick the right seeds. And we already talked about some of those aspects of choosing grass species or the grass seeds in terms of the species that you want to put in. So that's going to be related to climate zones and frost dates and moisture and soil type and things like that. But another thing that's also going to matter a lot is your seed quality and getting some seeds that actually have good and viable seeds in it. So seed mixes will usually have seed quality label that will tell you the percentage of germination of those seeds and the purity. So the purity is refers to how many actual seeds of the grasses that you want are in that bag, as opposed to maybe seeds from other crops or seeds from weeds or just inert material. So make sure that you read those labels for a seed mix that you acquire, because it might be a little bit more expensive to get good seed quality, but it's going to save you from having to use uh, a lot more of seeding rates or having to repeat the process, because most of your seeds that you thought you had in a bag were actually not seeds or were actually weeds, because there is an allowable amount of other things that your grass or your seed mixes can have, but you want to make sure that you get the best, if it's in your means to get good seed quality that has been tested recently and that has been created or that it's adapted to your zone. So after you got your weeds under control and you have selected the seeds that you want, you've got that seed mix, you want to start thinking about what the best seeding date is. And especially for dryland, it's going to matter a lot because you want to take advantage of the little moisture that you can get here in arid Colorado. So usually you're going to have two time frames where you can put in your seeds. And one of them will be a dormant seeding. So that usually is done after the temperature has cooled down enough to prevent germination. So sometime in late November. And then you're going to have your spring seeding that should be done shortly after the last frost is expected. So again, both of those time frames are basically designed or are basically made that way so that you can take advantage of some of the moisture that comes from snowmelt, And again, that's especially important for dryland fields where you're not going to have that irrigation, that initial irrigation that your plants may need during the first few months. Seedbed preparation is going to be very important. If you have the equipment, it's going to make a little bit of a difference in terms of what equipment you have available and how to prepare a good seedbed for those seeds to start germinating. So seed placement is one of those very important things. It's not a thing that will definitely make your seeding fail, but it can help you a lot if you can plant at the ideal depth of a grass seedling. So ideally you would place a grass seed at a depth of 1/2 to 1 inch, because if you plant seeds too deep into the soil, then they're going to need a lot more energy just to germinate, just to come out of the soil and start producing some leaves and some energy for themselves, as opposed to planting seeds too shallow in the soil where you're going to have a lot more exposure to the elements, and you're going to have seeds that are more exposed to animals eating them or the wind uh, blowing them away across the field, or water just flushing them down through your field. So definitely, if you have the right equipment, or if you can prepare some of that seed bed so that your seeds are placed at the ideal depth, it's gonna help out a lot in your seeding process. So some of the most common seeding equipment that usually people have available, it's number one, the easiest and cheapest broadcast seeding. You can have a setup kind of like what you see in the picture, where you have a four-wheeler and bucket and you can spread the seeds that way, or you can do it yourself by hand. I mean, there's a lot of ways that you can broadcast the seed. One good way to make sure that those seeds have a better chance of success is to prepare a till seed bed, or to make a little bit of a preparation of the soil to break it down on the surface so that you can get a little bit better seed to soil contact. And then after you have placed the seeds in that till seed bed, or that seed bed that you have already prepared, if you can drag or pack the soil after the seeds are placed, it's gonna make it a lot easier for seeds to not be so exposed to those um, environmental effects that can stop your seeds from germinating. A cultipacker is another tool that can also be used for grass seeding. Um, Again, it's another thing where you are probably better off if you have a teal seed bed, and then it will place the seeds in the little depressions. So it's gonna give the seeds a little bit of that soil to seed contact, but it doesn't cover the seeds completely. So again, dragging or packing the soil after you place the seeds is gonna play a very important role in terms of those seeds staying in the field. You can also use a drill to plant the seeds directly into the soil at the proper depth, but in this case, it's important that you have a grass drill as opposed to a grain drill. So, a grain drill is probably going to place your seeds way deeper than you need them to be, so that's not helping so much. So, definitely, grass drill, it's the best way to go. And then a no-till drill seeder is one of the best methods for placing grass seeds, because it will place those seeds directly into that existing vegetation. So there's not going to be that need of tilling a field. And so, because of that, it's going to have less effect of erosion, but it does require a no till planter, and it's usually available at your local conservation districts for rental. If you can get a hold of them in time, you should be able to rent it from them. And then moving on to fertilization. So fertilization should be done only based on a soil test. So make sure that you, if you are reseeding or overseeding a field, you take a soil test before that, so that you can apply those amendments or those nutrients into the soil at the best time possible. And usually, phosphorus and potassium might be the only things that you are going to need to apply, again, depending on what your soil test tells you. But if your soil is actually a little bit deficient in phosphorus and potassium, you may want to add a little bit of that into the soil before you place the seeds and make sure that you incorporate it in that top layer of the soil. Because these two nutrients are not very mobile in the soil, so there might be some of it down below, but not close enough for those initial plant roots to reach it. So that might be one thing that you can add if your soil test asks for phosphorus and potassium. And nitrogen, it's usually not recommended until your plants are established. And that's again only if your soil test says that you actually do need nitrogen. In many cases, especially in dry land, when you are grazing animals in the field, you're probably not going to need to be adding any more nutrients because your animals are already doing that for you as they walk and as they urinate in the fields and they bring some of that manure and break it down with their hooves. They play a very important role in creating that balance of nutrients from what they eat and bringing it back to the soils. In cases of irrigated hay fields, for example, then that is a case where you're probably going to want to be adding some of those nutrients into the soil. And again, you should be basing that only on a soil test. And then after you've covered all of those things, and you have those grasses already in field, if you are asking yourself when can you start grazing or where can you start taking some of that grass for hay, the answer is probably going to be you're going to need to wait a couple years, depending if you have irrigation or if you have a good rainfall during that year. You should wait until your grasses are fully established. And for some of those natives, it's going to take a long, long time, especially in dry land. So you're looking at 3 to 5 years for those grasses to be fully established so that you can graze animals in them without that risk of pulling the plant out when those animals are grazing. And as always, make sure that you wait until the grasses are between 6 to 8 inches tall to start grazing, and then remove animals from grazing once those plants are half of their initial height. So always stick to the take half, leave half principle once you have your grasses established. So the main takeaways for pasture vegetation to me would be if you have an established pasture that is not fulfilling your expectations for pasture, maybe you need to start looking at changing the management that you're giving, maybe reduce the mowing, maybe reduce the time when your animals are allowed to graze. And sometimes that change of management is going to highly reduce the need for you to reseed. Hopefully that change of management will let your grasses reseed themselves and populate those areas that maybe bear spots on the ground or reduce that weed pressure once you have figured out a change of management that works for you. And for fields that need complete renovation, for a field that you know for sure that you need to reseed because there's nothing growing, make sure that you study your land first and take as much time as needed to do that. So make sure that you know what soil type you have and what amount of moisture you get in reality in your field, what types of weeds you have, so that you can choose the best moment in the year and the best method of controlling those weeds. And definitely keep track of those other environmental issues that can make your seeding fail. So, this is the end of this part of the grass workshop. Thank you for listening. My contact information is on the screen. You can email me or call me, or you can call Lindsay Gonzalez in Boulder County if you have any questions about this section or any of the other sections of the grass workshop. And just a reminder of some of the other resources that we have available. You can download the Colorado Forage Guide by scanning that QR code, or you can look it up. Um, You can also visit the Small Acreage Management website. We have a lot of other webinars related to pasture management and other issues related to small acreage management. The link to the soil web survey is on the screen, or you can just Google it and you're definitely going to find it. And you can also subscribe to the Small Acreage Management newsletter, where I send out some information about upcoming events that might be relevant to you, or a quarterly newsletter with information about small acreage management issues. And last but not least, if you need more help, you can reach out to us as extension agents, or you can reach out to your local NRCS office to know about technical assistance and financial assistance that they can provide to you. So if you are trying to reseed for producing forage, maybe that's a good place to start looking for alternatives and that financial aid that can help you maybe purchase those seeds or implement some of those conservation techniques in your land. So make sure that you look up where your local conservation or your local NRCS office is and talk to them, and they'll be more than happy to help you. So thanks again for listening, and see you next time.